What would you do if you found photos of yourself sleeping, taken from inside your bedroom window? 47 photos, over 3 months. That happened to Marcus Torres in Kansas. But it gets worse. A mutated birth in Vermont, a human trafficking ring in North Carolina, and something that's been fed human flesh since 1940. 4 true farm horror stories that prove the scariest thing about rural America isn't the isolation. It's what thrives because of it. Subscribe if you can handle it. Drop your location in the comments now. Kansas, 2017, someone's watching. Story 1. The Feedlot Watcher. Marcus Torres didn't realize he was holding his breath until his lungs started to burn. The barn was black except for the thin cone of his flashlight, and the cattle had gone so silent it felt staged, like they were listening too. He took one step forward, boots sinking into damp straw, and that's when he heard it. Breathing. Not the wet animal breathing he'd grown up around. This was slow, controlled, patient, coming from right behind his shoulder. Marcus swung the light around so fast it blurred the beams across the rafters, and for half a second he caught the shape of something tucked between the beams and the stacked bales. Too upright to be a cow, too still to be a person who'd just been caught. The beam snapped back to empty wood. Marcus whispered, "Who's there?" and hated how small his voice sounded in his own barn. He raised his shotgun with shaking hands, telling himself it was a prank, a drifter, a kid from town, anything, normal. But what happened next changed everything. Because the barn door groaned behind him, not from the wind, from pressure, like someone was easing it closed. Marcus spun, barrel following the sound, and the flashlight caught the sliding latch moving on its own, inch by inch, until the metal clicked into place. For a moment he just stared, frozen by the simple truth. He wasn't the one controlling what happened inside his property anymore. His phone had no signal in there, it never did. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and he'd left his wife asleep because he'd told her it was probably coyotes again. The last time he'd heard this kind of screaming from the cattle, he'd found a calf caught in wire. This time there were no screams, only the sound of his own heartbeat and that slow breathing that seemed to follow him no matter where he turned the light. 24 hours earlier, Marcus had laughed at the idea of being scared on land his family had worked for generations. Kansas wheat and cattle weren't supposed to be haunted. They were supposed to be predictable. That morning he'd noticed the first thing, small, almost polite. The feed room padlock was hanging open, unbroken, like someone had borrowed it and put it back. Marcus blamed himself, his own forgetfulness, and kept moving because a farm doesn't care about your mood. By afternoon, the wind shifted and carried the smell of sun-baked grain and something else. Stale sweat, maybe, or old smoke, coming from the far edge of the feedlot where the tall grass met the fence line. He caught a glimpse of movement there, a dark vertical streak between the wheat heads, and when he focused, it was gone. Just wheat, just heat shimmer, just his imagination working overtime because harvest season makes everyone tired. That night, Marcus set up an old trail camera he used for coyotes, pointing it toward the access road and the barn. He told himself it was for peace of mind, and peace of mind was worth the embarrassment of being wrong. The next morning, he checked the SD card at his kitchen table while his coffee cooled beside his elbow. The first clips were nothing. Wind, moths, a raccoon sniffing the post. Then at 2:11 a.m., the camera caught a human figure standing at the edge of the frame. No face, just the suggestion of a head under a cap, shoulders too square, posture too comfortable for someone trespassing. The figure didn't walk across like a passerby. It stopped. It angled its head toward the house, and it stayed there, still as a fence post, for an entire minute. Marcus felt his throat go dry. He clicked to the next clip. The figure was closer. He didn't show his wife. He told himself he'd handle it because that's what men on farms tell themselves until it breaks them. He drove into town for new locks and a brighter flashlight, and on the way back he kept checking his mirrors because the footage had done something to his sense of space. Every empty ditch felt occupied. Every pickup behind him felt intentional. When he reached his property, the mailbox flag was up even though no mail had been delivered. He lowered it, confused, and noticed a thin strip of paper folded around the post like someone had wrapped it there with care. Inside were 3 words written in block letters. "You missed me." Marcus stood in the heat with that paper between his fingers, and for the first time the farm didn't feel like a home. It felt like a stage. That evening he walked the fence line with his shotgun and told himself the only reason his hands shook was anger. He found footprints in the soft ground near the wheat, boot prints deep and recent, leading toward the old grain silo his father hadn't used in years. The silo had always made Marcus uneasy, not for any supernatural reason, but because it was a reminder. Places on a farm don't die. They just wait. He approached slow, listening to the metallic tick of the silo's skin, expanding and contracting in the sun. The door was half open. He swore he'd kept it shut. He pushed it wider with the barrel and aimed his flashlight inside. The air smelled wrong, like damp cloth left too long in a closed room. The beam climbed over rusted rungs and dust, then landed on a pile of blankets and fast food wrappers arranged like a nest. A camping stove, a jug of water, and taped to the curved wall, dozens of printed photos fluttering slightly in the stale air. Marcus stepped closer and felt his stomach drop. They were photos of his house, his porch, his kitchen window glowing at night, his wife standing at the sink unaware, Marcus walking out to the truck, and then, closest, clearest, him, asleep in bed, mouth open, face turned toward the camera like he was posing. He couldn't move. His brain tried to reject what his eyes were seeing. The picture wasn't taken from outside, it was taken from inside the room. Marcus backed out so fast his shoulder hit the silo door, and that's when he heard the soft crunch of gravel behind him. He turned the light and caught a glimpse of someone standing just beyond the beam, far enough that the darkness still protected their face. They didn't run. They didn't speak. They simply lifted one hand, slowly, calmly, and pointed toward the barn, like they were directing him back to where they wanted him. Marcus raised the shotgun and yelled that he'd call the police, but the words sounded childish as soon as they left his mouth, because the figure just tilted its head, amused. Then it stepped back into the wheat and vanished without a sound, leaving Marcus alone with the photos and a certainty that made his skin prickle. Whoever this was, they weren't just watching, they were learning. So when the cattle started screaming after midnight, raw, terrified sounds that snapped Marcus out of bed, he didn't wake his wife. He didn't wait for daylight. He grabbed his shotgun and ran outside with the flashlight cutting tunnels through the dark, because fear doesn't always stop you. Sometimes it pushes you straight into the trap. He reached the barn and saw the door open like a mouth. The screaming stopped the moment he stepped inside. And now, standing in that suffocating silence, with the latch sliding shut behind him, Marcus finally understood the point of the photos. They weren't trophies. They were proof. Proof that someone could enter his life whenever they wanted, touch what they wanted, and leave without a trace. The breathing returned, closer than before, so close that the hairs on his neck lifted as if a warm mouth had hovered there. Marcus tightened his grip, forcing himself to swing the light one more time, and this time the beam caught it. Just for an instant, something crouched above him in the rafters, eyes reflecting back like coins, lips stretched in a grin that looked practiced. Marcus fired. The blast tore through straw and wood. The shadow dropped, but it didn't hit the ground like a body. It landed like a cat, silent. And the flashlight beam caught the last thing Marcus saw clearly, that it wasn't holding a weapon. It was holding his phone. Story 2. The Wrong Birth. Sarah Brennan still heard the sound in her head long after it stopped. The vet's scream, sharp and involuntary. The kind that didn't come from fear but from recognition, like his brain knew what it was seeing before his mouth could form a word. The birthing stall was lit by one hanging work lamp that threw everything into harsh yellow triangles. The slick straw, the heaving cow, the rope looped around Sarah's forearm and the calf halfway out, wrong in a way that made Sarah's stomach turn cold. It wasn't just that it was twisted. Plenty of calves came out dead or malformed, nature's ugly math on a farm. This was arranged. The calf's legs folded where they shouldn't, joints bulging like knots in wet wood, and the hide had a gray, bruised sheen that looked too human under the lamp. The cow gave one last strained bellow and the calf slid free with a heavy, obscene thud. The vet staggered backward, hand over his mouth, eyes wide and glassy. Sarah didn't move. She just stared, waiting for her mind to name it, to make it something ordinary. But the longer she looked, the more details rose up like splinters. The calf's ribcage fluttering under the skin as if it was breathing through a bag, the too wide mouth opening without sound. And the eyes, clouded, pale, unfocused, tracking her flashlight as if it understood the concept of light. She dropped the rope and stepped back, bumping into the stall door. The cow tried to stand and slipped, hooves scrabbling, terrified of what it had made. Sarah's hands were shaking so hard she could hear the tremor in her sleeves. "Is it alive?" she asked and hated herself for asking like it mattered. The vet didn't answer. He reached for the calf with gloved hands the way a person reaches for a live wire, careful, disbelieving. And when his fingers touched its flank, the calf jerked with a sudden, violent spasm. Something under its skin rippled, traveling from shoulder to hip, like a fist moving through a blanket. The vet stumbled away again, and his next words came out broken. "Don't touch it, Sarah, don't touch it." She hadn't been planning to. She couldn't stop staring, though, because her brain had latched onto a single thought and was turning it like a knife. This is coming from our land. And then, like a cruel punchline, the work lamp flickered once, twice, and went out. In the dark, the barn noises changed. It wasn't just the cow's panicked breathing anymore. There was a softer sound, too, wet and searching like something tiny trying to orient itself. Sarah fumbled for her flashlight and snapped it on, beam cutting across the stall. The calf's mouth opened wider than it should have, jaw unhinging with a slow, elastic pull, and the sound that came out wasn't a bleat. It was a long, thin rasp, like air being dragged through a straw that was full of dirt. The cow tried to back away and slammed into the boards. Sarah's stomach heaved. She turned her head and vomited into the straw, bitter and hot. And when she looked back, the calf had gone still again, as if it was watching her reaction and taking notes. Sarah swallowed bile and told herself it was shock. It was exhaustion. It was winter. It was anything except what her instincts were screaming, "Get out!" But getting out didn't mean leaving the farm. There were procedures, calls to make, animals to check, and the horrible responsibility of being the only adult in the room when something unexplainable happened. Sarah and the vet dragged a tarp across the stall entrance like it could stop whatever rules had been broken. He made a call to an emergency lab in Burlington, voice trembling as he tried to keep professional. Sarah phoned her husband, but her voice wouldn't work right, and all she could say was, "Don't come into the barn." When she hung up, she noticed the cow's water bucket was half empty, sloshing gently even though no one had bumped it. The surface moved as if something invisible had dipped a hand into it. She stared at the ripples until they calmed, and that's when she remembered something she'd ignored 2 weeks earlier. Her neighbor Edwin, leaning on his fence in the snow, face pale, telling her, "Don't drink the well water until spring." She'd laughed. Edwin was old, superstitious, the type who blamed bad weather on bad luck. Now his warning crawled back into her mind and sat there like a stone. The next morning, Sarah went to the kitchen sink and filled a glass from the tap, purely to prove to herself she could. The water looked clean. It smelled fine. But when she held it up to the window light, she saw faint threads inside it, almost like hair, almost like clear worms, drifting and curling lazily as if the water had its own pulse. She poured it out fast, heart hammering, and ran the tap until it ran cold enough to hurt. That afternoon she pulled water from the old hand pump, behind the shed, the one they used in summer when the main line froze. The water from the pump was darker, metallic. It left a reddish ring in the bucket. The cows drank it anyway, desperate. That night, 2 calves refused to eat. The next morning, one of them lay on its side, eyes wide, jaw working as if it was chewing something that wasn't there. Sarah watched its belly and saw the same ripple she'd seen under the tarp in the birthing stall. Something moving under skin, not a kick. A traveling motion. She called the county again. She called the state vet office. She called whoever would answer. People came in clean boots and neat jackets, asked careful questions, took samples, and spoke in low voices like their words could infect the air. They told her not to panic. They told her there were natural explanations. They told her they'd seen strange cases before. But none of them could look her in the eye for long. On the 3rd day, a man in a company-branded truck pulled up at the edge of her property and didn't get out. He sat there with the engine idling, watching the barn like it was a show he'd paid to see. Sarah walked toward him through the snow, fury warming her blood. When she reached the driver's window, he rolled it down only an inch. The smell of cigarette smoke spilled out. He said, "Ma'am, you can't be over here. This area's being handled." Sarah stared at him, confused. "Handled by who?" she demanded. The man's eyes flicked past her shoulder, toward her farmhouse, toward her barn, toward the line where her property met the abandoned lot next door. "Not your problem," he said, and rolled the window back up. That abandoned lot had belonged to a bankrupt feed supplier years ago. Nobody went there except teenagers, and even they stopped after someone found barrels in the weeds one summer. Sarah had forgotten about the barrels because farms teach you to forget things you can't fix. Now she couldn't stop thinking about them. That night, while her husband slept fitfully on the couch and the house smelled faintly of disinfectant, Sarah pulled on boots and a thick coat and walked the fence line with a flashlight. Snow creaked under her steps and the darkness beyond her beam felt crowded. When she reached the corner where her land met the abandoned lot, she saw tracks, fresh tire tracks pressed into the snow leading into the weeds. Her breath fogged hard. She stepped over the fence and followed them, heart punching at her ribs. The tracks ended near a shallow dip in the ground where the snow looked disturbed, as if something warm had been there recently. She swung her light down and saw a circle of melted slush, and in the center a black plastic cap sticking out of the earth like the top of a buried drum. Sarah knelt and wiped the slush away with her glove. The cap had a warning label on it, but the ink had been scratched off, scraped until it was unreadable. She gripped the cap and twisted it. Didn't budge. She tried again, harder, and felt it loosen with a sickening pop as trapped air escaped. A smell rolled out, chemical and sweet like rotting fruit mixed with gasoline. Sarah recoiled, gagging, eyes watering. Beneath the cap, the barrel wasn't empty. It was half full of a thick, dark liquid that moved sluggishly when her flashlight beam hit it, the surface shimmering with an oily rainbow. Something floated near the top, pale and soft, like a strip of skin. Sarah stared, unable to blink. Then the surface of the liquid trembled and that pale strip shifted as if it had muscle. Behind her, somewhere back toward the farm, a cow bellowed, one long, terrified sound that carried across the snow like a warning. Sarah stood so fast she nearly fell. She spun her flashlight toward the direction of the barn, and for 1 second she saw a figure standing at the edge of her property just beyond the fence. Not a worker, not her husband. Someone tall, perfectly still, watching her with the calm patience of a person who knew she'd finally found what she wasn't supposed to find. Sarah opened her mouth to shout, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. Because as Sarah looked back down at the open barrel, the thick liquid inside made a slow, deliberate swirl, as if something beneath it had turned over, waking up. No external sources were available to cite for this purely fictional narrative in this message. Story 3. The Seasonal Worker. The chain on the toolshed door was already on the ground when James Whitaker reached it, and for a second his mind refused to translate what his eyes were seeing. That chain never came off. Never. Not since his father's accident. Not since the first time he realized a farm could swallow a man and leave nothing but quiet behind. James raised the shotgun anyway, barrel trembling just enough to make him furious at himself, and pushed the shed door with his boot. It swung inward like it had been waiting. The smell hit him first. Hot metal, old oil, and something sour that didn't belong in any building meant for wrenches and fertilizer. Then he heard it. A muffled cry, so weak it sounded like it came from inside the walls. James stepped in, flashlight beam shaking across rakes and hanging tarps and stacked feed bags. The cry came again, closer now, and James found himself whispering, "Hello?" Like a fool, like the thing in the dark might answer, politely. His light landed on the floor and he saw drag marks in the dust, parallel lines like someone had been pulled, heels scraping toward the back corner where the shadows got thickest. He followed them without choosing to because his body was moving on instinct now, and when he reached the corner he saw the tarp. It was the kind of tarp every farmer owned, blue, frayed, full of tiny holes that let the flashlight leak through like stars. But this one was tied down with rope, knotted tight, deliberate. James grabbed the edge and yanked it up in one violent motion, and what he saw behind it hollowed him out so fast he almost dropped the gun. A cramped space had been carved out behind stacked pallets, just big enough for a person to crouch. There was a water jug, a bucket, a phone-charging brick plugged into an extension cord, and in the center, wrists bound with duct tape, was a girl with dirt on her face and terror so complete it looked like exhaustion. Her mouth was taped, too, and when she saw James, she made a sound that wasn't a scream. It was a pleading noise, desperate and animal, as if she didn't fully believe rescue was real. James took one step toward her and froze because something moved in the darkness above the pallets. Something tall shifting its weight like it had been standing there the entire time. "James," a voice said softly from behind him, warm as a handshake. "Put the gun down before you do something you can't take back." James didn't turn because turning meant giving the shadows his eyes. He felt the air change in the doorway, felt the presence settle there with awful confidence. Ethan Cross. Seasonal worker. Quiet smile, strong back, the kind of man who showed up when you were behind on labor and thanked you like you were doing him a favor. Ethan had been perfect for 3 weeks, up before dawn, no complaints, fixing fences James didn't even realize were loose. He'd called James Sir the first day, made jokes about how the heat in North Carolina could melt a man into the soil. And James had laughed because it felt good to trust someone. He'd even brought groceries once, said he noticed James eating canned soup too often. It had felt like kindness. Now James heard that same kindness in Ethan's voice, and it made his skin crawl. "How long?" James asked, voice tight. He kept the shotgun aimed at the darkness in front of him because he didn't know where the real threat was. "How long has she been here?" Ethan sighed like James was being unreasonable. "That's not the question," he said. "The question is whether you want your wife safe, whether you want your farm safe, whether you want to keep sleeping at night." James's stomach turned cold at the mention of his wife, asleep back at the house, trusting that the locked doors and distance meant something. The girl behind the pallets shook her head frantically, eyes wet, trying to tell him something through tape and terror. James stepped closer to her anyway, lowering the shotgun just enough to reach for the tape on her mouth. That's when Ethan moved, not rushing, not charging, just closing the distance with a speed that felt practiced. James caught a flash of something in Ethan's hand, not a knife, a syringe. Clear barrel, thin needle, the kind you'd use on livestock. Ethan's calm voice didn't change. "Don't," he said, almost gentle. "You don't know what you're doing." James jerked back, heart punching, and fired the shotgun into the shed wall on instinct. The blast cracked the air like thunder and sent splinters screaming, and the girl flinched so hard she hit her head on the pallet. Ethan didn't even jump. He just stood there in the doorway, half lit by the weak moonlight, eyes reflecting like a predator's. "Now you've made noise," Ethan said, voice soft with disappointment. "And that's going to complicate things." Because what happened next changed everything. From somewhere outside the shed, deeper in the property, an engine turned over. Not James's truck. A different vehicle, idling slow, then cutting off, doors closing, footsteps in the grass. James felt his blood drain as he realized Ethan wasn't alone. Not tonight, not ever. This wasn't one sick man. This was a system. James backed out of the shed, keeping the gun between himself and Ethan, and the humid night air hit him like a slap. He heard the footsteps coming closer now, steady, unhurried, like men who knew they weren't the ones being hunted. Ethan stepped out after him, hands open as if he wanted to calm a scared animal. "You can still make the right choice," he said. "You can walk away, you can go back to bed, you can forget you saw anything." He nodded toward the farmhouse, where one upstairs window glowed faintly. "Or you can be a hero, and heroes get buried on farms all the time." James swallowed hard and forced his voice to work. "Let her go," he said. "Walk off my land." Ethan smiled then, small, controlled, the smile of a man used to winning. "It doesn't work like that," he said, and tilted his head toward the driveway. "They're here." James turned just enough to see two silhouettes moving between the trees near the equipment shed. One of them carried something long that caught moonlight. Metal, maybe a rifle barrel, maybe a crowbar. The other held a phone up like it was recording. James's mind snapped into a brutal clarity. They didn't care about being seen. Being seen was part of it. Fear was part of it. Power was part of it. He looked back at Ethan, and the seasonal worker's eyes were bright, almost excited. Like this was the moment he'd been building toward since the first friendly joke in the heat. James made a choice that felt like swallowing fire. He lifted the shotgun, not at Ethan, not at the silhouettes, but at the truck parked beside the shed, and fired into the tire. Rubber exploded with a sharp crack. Ethan's smile vanished. "You stupid," Ethan started, voice finally breaking, and James used that half-second to slam his shoulder into Ethan's chest. Ethan staggered, surprised by the force, and James ran, not toward the house, not toward safety, but back into the shed, back to the girl, because if he left her there, she would disappear and no one would ever prove she existed. He tore the tape from her mouth, and she sucked air like she'd been drowning. "My name's Lila," she gasped, voice shredded. "He took my phone. He said if I screamed, he'd—" James cut her off, slicing at the duct tape with a pocket knife so worn it barely opened. "Can you run?" he asked. Lila nodded too fast, tears streaking, and James pulled her up. He heard Ethan outside barking orders now, the calm gone, replaced by real anger. Boots pounded the dirt. The shed door creaked as someone grabbed it. James shoved Lila toward the back of the, shed, where a loose board in the wall opened into a narrow gap between structures. An old trick for slipping tools through without opening the main door. Go, he hissed. Don't stop. Run to the road. Keep running. Lila squeezed through, scraping her shoulder, and vanished into the night. The shed door ripped open. One of the silhouettes stepped in, face still hidden, and raised something heavy. James lifted the shotgun again, but he was out of shells. He could feel that in the weight of it, the useless hollow. The man advanced, and James did the only thing he could. He swung the shotgun like a club, smashing it into the man's jaw with a crack that made his hands sting. The man went down. Another shape filled the doorway. Ethan, breathing hard now, no longer pretending to be reasonable. His eyes were wild with a kind of offended rage, like James had ruined a performance. "You don't get to take from me," Ethan said, voice shaking. He raised the syringe. James lunged. The needle grazed his arm, a sharp sting, and panic flared. Farm chemicals, tranquilizers, anything could be in that barrel. James grabbed Ethan's wrist and slammed it against the doorframe. The syringe clattered away. Ethan's free hand came up with a knife this time, flashing silver, and James barely twisted aside, feeling the blade slice his shirt and kiss skin. He headbutted Ethan hard, and for the first time Ethan made a sound of pain, real and ugly. Outside, a car horn blared once, long, desperate. Lila. She'd made it to the road. Someone had seen her. Ethan heard it too. His face changed, calculation replacing rage. He stepped back, eyes narrowing, and James saw the truth in that look. Ethan would leave. He would vanish. He would do this again somewhere else, on some other quiet property where a tired man needed help and wanted to believe in decency. Ethan backed into the night, voice low and venomous. "This isn't over," he said. "You live out here. You think you're alone, but you're not." Then he turned and melted into the darkness with the other men, disappearing between the trees like they'd never existed. James stood in the shed doorway, shaking, listening to the distant sound of an engine starting and fading away. His arm burned where the needle had touched him, and his stomach churned with delayed terror. The farm around him looked the same as it had every night of his life. Fields, fences, stars. Yet it felt permanently altered, as if the land itself had learned a new kind of violence. When the police finally arrived, lights flashing across the dirt road, James realized something he couldn't stop thinking about. The worst part wasn't that Ethan had been evil. The worst part was how easy it had been to let him in. No external sources were available to cite for this purely fictional narrative in this message. Story 4. What the root cellar fed. Rebecca Okafor hit the floor so hard her shoulder went numb, but the pain barely registered because something had her by the ankle and it was pulling. The root cellar door above her was a crooked rectangle of moonlight, and beneath that light the cellar was a pit of wet, cold air that smelled like pennies and old rot. Rebecca clawed at the dirt with her fingernails, boots scraping, heels sliding toward the black gap between shelves. Her flashlight rolled away and spun, throwing frantic arcs across glass jars and rusted canning lids, and for one strobing second the beam caught what had grabbed her. Fingers, too many fingers, stacked like pale roots, bending the wrong way. The joints moving with smooth confidence. Rebecca tried to scream, but the cellar swallowed sound. It came out as a dry, useless rasp. She yanked with both hands, the skin on her ankle burning as if it was being peeled, and the thing tightened its grip with a strength that didn't feel muscular. It felt inevitable. She grabbed the cellar threshold and held on, knuckles whitening, and the wood creaked under the strain like it might split. The fingers tugged again. Slow, patient. Like this had happened before, and the outcome was usually the same. Rebecca's heels slipped over the edge, and she felt the cold below her rise up like a breath. But what happened next changed everything. The thing paused, as if it had heard something. A sound, faint, far away, coming from the farmhouse above. Not footsteps, not a voice. A lullaby played from a warped old music box, thin notes wobbling through the floorboards like a memory. The fingers loosened, just a fraction, enough for Rebecca to jerk her leg free and slam the cellar door shut with both hands. The iron latch caught with a brutal clack. Rebecca sat there on the kitchen floor shaking, staring at the cellar door as if it might lift itself open and climb out. She could still feel the handprint on her ankle, cold and damp, each finger's pressure mapped into her skin. When she finally stood, she noticed the carving on the cellar door again, the warning she'd thought was a family joke when she first arrived. Feed it or flee. The letters were deep, gouged with the kind of force that comes from panic. And beneath the carving, half hidden by old paint, was a second line in smaller, shakier script. It learns. 2 weeks earlier, Rebecca had driven to Iowa believing she was inheriting silence. The farmhouse had belonged to her grandmother, Ada, a woman Rebecca remembered as stern and religious, the type who prayed over meals and never wasted anything. After Ada's funeral, the lawyer had handed Rebecca the keys and said the farm was in surprisingly good shape. The neighbors had nodded too fast when Rebecca introduced herself, eyes flicking toward the barn, then away. One of them, a woman with chapped hands and a polite smile, had said, "Your grandmother kept to her routines." Like it was praise. Another had leaned closer and whispered, "Don't open the cellar," before walking off as if she hadn't spoken at all. Rebecca assumed it was small-town superstition, the kind of folklore people repeated because it gave shape to boredom. She'd laughed it off the first night when she heard a faint thump under the kitchen floor, blaming the pipes, the settling foundation, rats. Old houses talked, that's what she told herself. Old houses talked, and lonely places made you imagine things. On the third day, while unpacking in the attic, she found the journal. It was wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside an empty flour tin like someone was hiding it from the future. The first page had her grandmother's handwriting, sharp and precise. "If you are reading this, you have already done what I prayed you wouldn't." Rebecca's throat tightened as she turned the pages. Ada wrote about seasons and yields and weather, but threaded through the ordinary. Farm notes were entries that didn't belong in any rational life. The cellar is hungry. The cellar is awake. Do not let it hear your name. There were instructions, too, written like recipes. What time to go down, what to carry, what not to say. Rebecca felt stupid for reading it like it was entertainment, like it was a scary story someone wrote to spook a granddaughter. Then she reached the page dated October 1940, and the tone changed completely. Ada wrote about her own mother and her mother's mother and a drought that nearly killed them. "We begged God. God didn't answer. Something else did." The ink on the next line was smeared as if the pen had paused while a hand shook. "It promised the farm would live if we fed it what it wanted." Rebecca shut the journal and went downstairs in daylight, angry at herself for being rattled. She made coffee, opened windows, let the clean wind move through the house like a reset. That's when she noticed the kitchen floorboard, one plank, slightly raised, scuffed at the edge like it had been pried up and put back down many times. She crouched and pressed it. It gave a millimeter, then settled. Beneath it, the faintest vibration hummed, like a distant engine idling underground. Rebecca's coffee suddenly tasted wrong, metallic. She stood and walked outside, deciding she needed air, proof of normality. The barn stood quiet in the afternoon sun. Chickens pecked at the dirt. Everything looked harmless. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the normal world was just a thin layer laid over something old and listening. That night she woke to the sound of someone moving in the kitchen. Slow footsteps. Barely there. She held her breath, heart racing, telling herself it was the house settling again. But then came the unmistakable scrape of wood, like a chair being pulled across the floor. Rebecca reached for her phone. No signal. The farmhouse was too far from the nearest tower, and the internet was down. She lay rigid, in the dark, listening, until the footsteps stopped directly above the cellar door. Then came a soft tapping from below the floorboards, answering the footsteps above like a conversation in knocks. One tap. Pause, two taps, pause. A long, dragging scratch. Rebecca's skin prickled. She whispered, "Hello?" And the moment the word left her mouth, the tapping stopped. The next morning, she found mud on the kitchen floor. Not a lot, just a smear of dark, wet earth leading from the cellar door to the sink and back again, as if something had climbed out, explored, and returned. Rebecca stared at it for a long time, waiting for a practical explanation to arrive. It didn't. She cleaned it with bleach until her hands smelled raw. Then she checked every lock in the house twice. She told herself she'd sell the farm. She told herself she'd leave. But leaving felt like failing her grandmother, like letting the land die, like breaking a promise she didn't understand. And beneath that, and guilt, was something uglier. Curiosity. A need to know what could make a whole town look away when her name was spoken. So she opened the cellar. At first it looked normal. Stone steps descending into a cool storage space, shelves lined with dusty jars, potato crates, old canning equipment. The air was colder down there, damp enough to bead on her skin. She took 2 steps, then 3, flashlight cutting through thick darkness, and the smell thickened into something sweet, sour, and alive. That's when the light fell on the back wall and Rebecca saw the scratch marks. Long, vertical gouges in the stone, as if something had tried to climb out and had kept trying for decades. The gouges weren't random. They formed shapes, loops and spirals, almost like writing. Rebecca stepped closer and the hairs on her arms rose because the marks weren't just in the stone. They were in the wood shelves too, in the jars, in the floor. Everywhere her beam landed, the same pattern repeated, like the cellar had been teaching itself language using whatever surface it could reach. She should have left then. She didn't. She walked deeper toward the back corner where the shelves ended, and the dirt floor sloped down into a darker patch that didn't look like shadow. It looked like absence. The temperature dropped sharply, so fast it felt like stepping into winter. Her breath turned visible. The flashlight beam dimmed slightly as if the air was thick. Rebecca's chest tightened. She heard a sound from the darkness ahead, a wet inhale, slow and deliberate. Then another. Her stomach turned. She whispered, "Who's there?" Again, unable to stop herself, and the darkness answered with a soft clicking noise like nails tapping together in anticipation. Then the fingers came up from below and grabbed her ankle. Now Rebecca stood in her kitchen, the cellar door shut, the journal open on the table. Her hands shook as she flipped pages, hunting for the part she'd ignored. Ada's final entries weren't about fear, they were about exhaustion. It doesn't want animals anymore. It knows the difference. It wants what the farm produces best. Us. Rebecca's mouth went dry. She looked at her ankle and saw beneath the red marks a faint residue. Dark smudges like soil, but it didn't wipe away. It sank into her skin as if it was being absorbed. Rebecca turned the page and found a list of names written in her grandmother's careful hand, each name crossed out with a single line. Some names had dates beside them, some didn't. At the bottom of the list was one empty line left blank, waiting like a place setting at a table. A soft tap sounded from beneath the kitchen floor. 1 tap. Pause. 2 taps. Pause. The same rhythm as before. Rebecca stared at the cellar door, breath shallow, and in the silence she realized the worst part. It wasn't trying to break out. It didn't need to. It had lived under this house for generations, fed by routine and obedience, patient enough to wait out any rebellion. It wasn't trapped. It was rooted. And now that Rebecca had opened the door, it knew something it hadn't known before. It knew her name.